So in this video, I'm going to finish up chapter 2 of the Ethics of Ambiguity, talk about the transition from the serious man to nihilism to the character of the adventurer, and then skip over a couple of personalities to get to the end. Beauvoir's final goal, where we will the freedom of others at the same time willing our own freedom, which is the only sustainable way of understanding ourselves and our relationship to the world. So let's take a look at page 51. We saw that the serious man's problem, their unwillingness to make the transition from childhood to adulthood, unwillingness to recognize the fact that they are mortal, the fragility of their being, and the subjectivity of their values, was that they willed a cause, and that they were willing to will a cause at the extent of the manipulation and destruction of other human beings. They made the cause essential, and they made themselves and they made other people's non-essential. So if you take a look at page 51, the problem is the serious man does all this and believes themselves to be happy. But the problem is that at a certain point, the serious man experiences like grave doubts about what's actually happening with his relationship to the world. The problem is, if you do your ethical relationship to the world like this, you start to fall into a state of preoccupation and of worry. She says, everything is a threat to the serious man, since the thing which he has set up as an idol is an externality, and thus is in relationship with the whole universe, and consequently is threatened by the whole universe. And despite all the precautions he takes, he'll never be the master of the exterior world, which he has decided to submit himself to. So he'll constantly be upset by the uncontrollable course of events. So this is a problem, because it goes back to trying to understand the precise metaphysical relationship I have to my selfhood, and the relationship I have to the values that I decide matter to me. If I try to say that the cause is essential, then I will be upset the first time that someone disses the cause. If someone says, no, communism is not important, I get really upset, because I'm like, no, you don't understand. Communism is essential. It is like the essential cause in the world. So when I affirm a cause in this way that covers over my own free relation to the willing of the value of the cause, everything becomes a threat to me. This guy, the serious guy, will always be saying he's disappointed because he wants to have the world harden into a thing, into the essentiality of the cause, which is belied by the very movement of life. The future will contest his present successes. He starts thinking about, what if my cause fails tomorrow? His children will disobey him. His friends perhaps disagree with him. His will be opposed by those of strangers. He'll be a prey to ill humor and bitterness. His very successes have a taste of ashes, because he's trying to realize an impossible synthesis of the fragility of his values that he wills and the essentiality that he is giving to them. He's still trying to will himself into God in a way. He's still trying to be the essential being. He's trying to make himself more than Allah. And his tragedy is that he's not it, and he kind of at the edge of his consciousness understands that he's not. Therein, she says in a great line on page 52, there then blazes forth the absurdity of a life which is sought outside of itself, the justifications which it alone could give itself. So the serious man's problem is that, again, like everyone else, he's failing to take responsibility for his freedom in the world and his relationship to the values that he affirms are important to him. And as the second most popular failure of humanity, you see him a lot. So you can amuse yourself by coming up with other categories of causes that people are willing as essential. But so here on page 52, she makes the transition to nihilism. Once you attempt to try to escape your contingency by making the cause essential, and you realize that this is impossible, sort of the next possibility for you, the individual, is that you realize that it's all impossible, and so you go too far in the other direction, and you will yourself as nothing. She says, we call this attitude nihilistic. He wants to be nothing, and this nothing that he dreams of is yet another sort of being. Nihilism is a disappointed seriousness which is turned back upon itself. There's a fundamental contradiction in any nihilist attempt to understand themselves as a nihilist. When you say, I want to be nothing, that is a contradiction. If you were simply nothing, you wouldn't be anything at all. And so if I say like nothingness exists, in a way I've made a self-contradictory statement, because I'm trying to will as existent a thing that is non-existent. And so for a human to take up this as an ethical understanding of their self and their relationship to others, it's going to be a peculiarly twisted and a peculiarly like, I don't know, the metaphor that I'm thinking of is fizzy. It's so tight of a contradiction of yourself. I'm willing myself as a thing, and that thing is nothing. It has a lot of power and a lot of volatility. So the first sort of like less troubling way of being a nihilist is, for example, is Baudelaire, the negative poet, who feels a burning rancor in regard to the values of his childhood, even though this hatred of the values of his childhood still involves some respect for them. Scorn alone liberates him. So instead of negating himself or others, Baudelaire attempts to negate the values that people told him were correct, which he later realized were incorrect, by just scorning all of them and saying that everything is trash, everything is dumb, everything's wrong, everything's canceled. She admires Baudelaire as sort of like a more meaningful way of giving in to this desire to negate the world once you realize that the world isn't absolute. It's not as strong as you thought it was. You want to call it fake, you want to call it nothing. You call it dumb, you want to say that everyone's a poser. And to say that by means of poetry that you write, showing that you still kind of respect the things that you're negating by paying attention to them is a more reasonable way of being a nihilist. She, in Beauvoir's autobiography, she talks about how she was sort of attracted to the nihilists of her time who were negating by means of critique, who wanted to critique everything. And she sort of admired like the fizzy quality, the volatility of the release of willing negating everything, trying to say that everything is dumb and everything is stupid. So let's see, at the bottom of page 53, she gives a couple more varieties of nihilism. She's going to sketch out quite a few. There's more than just like one or two ways of actually like attempting to negate the world, to say that everything is nothing. She says, you can be a man who gives yourself to a cause that you know to be lost. You know that the thing that you're supporting is doomed to failure. So you support the thing that is doomed to non-existence. So you will a thing that you know to be non-existent in sort of like this grand attempt to laugh at the world by showing how the world is really nothing by supporting something that is itself nothing. Any lost cause one person imagine would fall into that. You condemn yourself within the condemned universe. Like people who are still devoted to the Confederacy in this day and age. Another man devotes his time and energy to an undertaking which was not doomed to failure at the start, but which he himself is bent on ruining. So you find a big project that you believe to be a fantastical, brilliant cause, and you self-sabotage or sabotage others in order to make the cause itself fall to pieces. That's nihilism too. Another human, rejects each of his projects one after the other, frittering them away in a series of caprices, and thereby systematically annulling the ends which he aims at. You try a lot of different projects, you flip from one project to the other, and you never commit to them seriously in a meaningful way, and so you sort of fritter away your energy by pretending to take up a real something as serious. She says this is where Dadaist incoherence comes from. here she goes into 54 again, speaking about how this fundamental contradiction plays itself out. The will to negation is forever belying itself, for it manifests itself as a presence at the very moment it displays itself. It's when we saw in the case of the subman was always trying to subsume their consciousness in something else because they didn't want to admit that they were conscious of their own freedom and the responsibility of that freedom. So the will to negation is trying to do this too. But the problem was when I say I negate, I scorn, I hate, I cancel, I am saying I am still an I that is attempting to say no to something else. And that drives the nihilists nuts. What they really want is the same thing as the subman. They want to dissolve themselves. The same thing as the serious man. They want to find some other thing to be. And the nihilist who does not resign himself to suicide immediately falls into all sorts of weird contradictions. And she traces this through different social movements like surrealism and Dadaism again. The simple way is to simply destroy your body or to ruin your mind with drugs or other causes. You can engage in moral suicide. You can negate aesthetic spiritual values. But then the rule of negating these values becomes itself a value. So like to be countercultural becomes its own positive value. So the nihilist feels pretty embarrassed to be countercultural because counterculture becomes a positive value that we as a society affirm. It's good to be countercultural. So these are all relatively trivial things. But then to be a more serious nihilist takes a darker turn on page 55. If you reject your own existence, you also have to reject the existences which confirm it. The fact that other people are still alive to notice you existing, even when you're trying to negate yourself or to negate others, starts to drive you insane. There should be nothing, says the nihilist. So the nihilist says, all right, I see the other in the world. I need to destroy it. And this desire to destroy immediately takes the form of a desire for power. She compares this to Nazism, to Nietzsche. It makes sense if you're struggling with the existence of your own consciousness and you've gotten to the place where you want to say no to the world, that if you can destroy other people, you'll temporarily feel some kind of satisfaction. Does it do away with the burning problem of your sense of your own inadequacy to the world? No, it doesn't. So a lot of mass murderers have to also end in suicide because that's what they wanted. They wanted to negate the others who witnessed them, and they wanted to negate themselves. Does that make them satisfied? No, it's some kind of like volatile hurricane of self-negation. And it's hilarious to see the contrast between the trivial Baudelaire, the surrealists, the Dadaists, everybody trying to follow the same patterns, sometimes with very trivial results and then sometimes with quite destructive ones. So that would be her analysis of a lot of the social problems that we find ourselves having at the present. We see ourselves in a failed attempt to master the world. We see institutions not having the same values, not actually being able to affirm the values as essential that we thought that they did. We see ourselves adrift in a world where we know that we have to affirm our own values, but we're deeply dissatisfied by saying something is important because it matters to me. And so nihilism is a natural outgrowth of all these social forces combined with our basic psychology. So if all these things are true, that this is a fundamental mistake, there are better ways of dealing with what we are and what our relationship to the world is. We need to find a different way, a way around this problem of existence without destroying others. So here she transitions to the next character, who's slightly better than the nihilist, although he too has his problems, the adventurer. she notes at the top of page 58 that when I realize that the world is not as essential as it was claimed, I don't necessarily just want to kill it. I could also say, well, there's still a gratuity of existence, a kind of joy, or even a childish joy in pure existence itself. I don't have to negate it in order to enjoy it. I could just take it for what it is. In the first chapter, she noted that the second chapter, I'm sorry, the beginning of the second chapter, that when certain women in certain positions of relative economic stability are told that they don't make any important decisions, that they are ruled by the husband in the situation, they're ruled by their relationship to the values of their class, they can sort of take a delightful irresponsibility towards their position and take the kind of gratuitous delight in existence that you see in a child. They can enjoy the world because it's meaningless, or rather because it's insignificant. They don't have a real stake or a real possibility of actually willing it as a free, independent person who takes responsibility for themselves, because someone has told them they don't have that power and they believe it. The adventurer is like that. He keeps a taste for the existence that he possesses, that he originally felt as a joy. This is page 58. This is a real contrast to John Stuart Mill, who, when he was telling us to pursue a life of hedonism while also attempting to maximize the greatest good for the maximum number of people, he said we have to content ourselves with a life that has a steady number of small pleasures. We can't be seeking euphoria as we used to, which was a little dark on his point, and I think Beauvoir is at least offer a slightly more hopeful vision of existence, that there might be some kind of way that we can experience joy in pure existence again. And the adventure is an example of that. They throw themselves into their undertakings with zest, exploration, conquest, war, speculation, love, politics. They like action for their own sake. They find joy in spreading through the world a freedom which remains indifferent to the content. They negate the serious world. They find people who take up causes foolish. What they enjoy is adventuring, going through life without a fixed attachment to a government, a regime, a social plan. They enjoy simply being free and seeing if they can live by their wits. Her examples here, she talks about Lawrence of Arabia, who you can watch attempt to have existential freedom in the movie Lawrence of Arabia, which I highly recommend. And another example elsewhere is Alexander Dumas, who himself was an adventurer. He was an arms dealer at a time, like going to many different places trying to buy and sell and participating in wars on the side. Did he support any one war like with his full moral force? No. He was just kind of participating on the side. T. Lawrence, the person who Lawrence of Arabia is the model for, she speaks of as a higher model of this. He does attempt to engage in some kind of freedom for all. It's just that he doesn't want to carry through past the great moment of adventure, past the great moment of success. So we admire the adventurer because they show to us an image of freedom. They show to us somebody who looks like they've almost done it. They're not trying to negate, they're not trying to be serious, they're not trying to be a subman. But you see, if you examine their life past the moment of their great success, you start to see in their relationship to other people that they still haven't quite got it. They still haven't managed to will the freedom of themselves perfectly because they are too focused on the joy in their own existence and the respect they get from other people because they are so awesome, that they sort of fail to treat other people as though they were fully free. They tend to become the tools of a government who allows them a moment to confirm their contempt regarding the common herd. So this relates to Nietzsche. There's a sort of a belief that if I'm doing morality right, if I'm doing ethics right, I'm the one free person and the rest of everyone is somehow like less free or less important than I am. And I show it by my amazing adventure status, where I go from one Indiana Jones scenario to another, being the only person who lives free from convention. But so when I see someone doing that, that rings a bell because, again, I can't will my freedom without willing others. So even the adventurer shows themselves to be insufficient. If they become the tool of fascist governments, they are not managing to actually be free. They're still a tool of somebody else. She says on page 62, Hegel's criticism of the tyrant applies to the adventurer to the extent that he himself is a tyrant, or at least the accomplice of an oppressor. Nobody can save himself alone. The adventurer believes themselves to accomplish this, when in fact what they're doing is just being very callous towards the situations that they find themselves in. They abandon others to the story of their own heroism. She says, when the adventurer dies, he surrenders his whole life into the hands of men. That's page 63. The only meaning it will have is the only meaning that the other people confer on it. The adventurer knows this because he talks about himself, often in books. And so he realizes at the very end that what he may have really wanted was honor and respect from each other, from one another all along. And at the very end of his life, he has a fundamental crisis because he realizes his life was actually futile. While he was alive, he could be famous and beloved and be glorified as the Indiana Jones of the story, but it can't sustain itself past his own death. So he sort of just dissolves at the moment of his recognizing this fundamental problem in his understanding of selfhood. All right, so before she ends the chapter, she goes through a couple more characters which are interesting, but we don't really have time to go over. The passionate man, somebody who gives themselves to just the power of their emotions and their subjectivity. Very interesting. It's related to somebody who gives himself to love as the highest good. It's related to the critic who believes himself outside of the process of critique. They don't rally to any cause, they believe themselves outside of it. But then they only become the shameful servant of the cause to which they have not chosen to rally. She talks briefly about the artist and the writer. They can be better if they recognize their work is imperfect, but if they hold it up as an essential goal, they start to fail. And here she starts, around 69, she starts getting to the very, wrapping up to her final point. She says, there's no way for a man to escape this world. It's this world in which we have to realize ourselves morally. Freedom must project itself toward its own reality through a content whose value it establishes. Freedom can't be engulfed in a goal, and it can't dissipate itself vainly without attaining a goal. We have to find concrete ways to realize our freedom. And so here's where she gets to the final point, which has its roots in Kant, that I cannot will myself, freedom cannot will itself as such without aiming at an open future. She says, every man needs the freedom of other men, and in a sense, always wants it, even though they are a tyrant. The only thing we fail to do is assume honestly the consequences of such a wish. So if we really understood the way in which our basic ethical, spiritual, and moral desires layer over each other, we would understand that what we really want all along, the only solution to our freedom is to recognize the freedom of others. I can't get rid of myself. I can't dominate others in an attempt to claim my freedom. I can't ignore others in an attempt to negate my freedom. I can't negate others in an attempt to reclaim my freedom. I have to do this very difficult balancing act of willing myself as free and willing others at the same time. Is this easy? No. Is there an obvious, concrete solution to this state of affairs, this balance between self and other? No, not really. But it is the only solution that we naturally are oriented towards, and it's the only thing that's going to keep us from falling into these broken ways of treating each other like we were mere objects, or things that can be destroyed or manipulated to subvert, to attain my own ends. She says on page 72, man can find a justification of his own existence only in the existence of other men. Moral anxiety does not come from man from without. We find within ourselves the anxious question, what's the use? Or to put it better, man himself is this urgent interrogation. We are left with this problem of the fragility of our existence, and our entire life asks the question, what can I do about it? So the only responsible way forward is to recognize that I concern others and they concern me. And to will myself free is to also will others. So that's the end of Beauvoir.